Our computers shut down, and then a screen of death appeared on the staff computers. At first, we couldn't believe something was wrong with our software.
Medoc, the company's software, transmitted tax data to financial authorities.
They chose software that almost every company in Ukraine used.
We reported it to the cyber police, but they didn't come. Finally, I went there myself, filed a complaint, and said, "You are required to respond."
But it was too late. From here, the attackers were able to spread their malware to millions of computers. The name of the virus, NotPetya.
They were asking for money. But if you paid, that money was going to go nowhere. They couldn't actually unlock your computer.
Odessa, southern Ukraine. Here, the computers of the world's largest shipping company, Maersk, were hit. In June 2017, none of its 130 offices could access their data and were forced to use pen and paper. Even so, it became a super spreader in the NotPetya epidemic. The estimated damages totaled $10 billion.
It was the most consequential cyber attack in history by pure cost and scale.
They came, did their duty, and had us all wonderfully arrested. In the night, they took out 150 servers. That was everything the company had.
Software had become a weapon, programmed by an invisible group of hackers called Sandworm.
When we first told the world about Sandworm, a few people took notice, but mostly people didn't.
NotPetya was a diversion tactic to cover up the power they had over Europe and America.
They're basically pretending to be criminal to kind of cover their tracks. And people for years have said, how many people do you think are behind this? I'm blown away by it's just a handful of people.
I was sitting in front of the TV with my wife and son, watching a movie about Edward Snowden, when suddenly the power went out. After an hour and a half of power outage, the water would have frozen and blown the pumps. A disaster that would have taken about 6 months to repair.
It took them an hour, but technicians at state-owned power company Ukrenergo managed to flip the switches mechanically, just in time to prevent damage. The problem was no accident. It was the work of the Sandworm Group.
We don't know these people. We don't know their names or who they work for. But they're not doing it for fun. They're being paid for it.
We believe it was a large group of people were involved because they were very fast and very actively working on several systems.
Oleksiy Yasinski investigated the incident on behalf of the state power company. Back in 2015, he had noticed unusual server failures at a media company.
When we checked the log files of various computers, we realized how dangerous the situation was.
The hackers had been penetrating Ukrainian networks for months. They scouted out both companies and authorities, planting their malware.
Discovering an infrastructure in the environment which you don't know, it's something similar as if you try to discover a house while being completely blind. So the attacker would need to go from one network to another. It's just like walking from one room to another, opening and opening yet another door until you find that equipment, or basically a room which you're looking for, which is hidden in behind.
They located the SCADA control system. From there, the facility's machinery could be accessed directly. With virtual access to the control room, the attackers could flip the switches undetected. That's exactly what they planned to do. They placed their code like a time bomb, set to the date December 17th, 2016.
These weren't individual actions. It was a well-funded, well-run organization.
The attack on the 300 kilovolt computer-controlled substation was historic. If a computer virus directly attacks machines and systems, it's known as a cyber-physical attack. Carrying out such attacks is complex, expensive, and therefore rare. Only about 10 such incidents are known to have taken place. The first occurred in 2009, when the US and Israel unleashed the Stuxnet virus on Iranian nuclear facilities. It destroyed 1,000 centrifuges in a uranium enrichment facility. A virtual attack with physical consequences. And it opened Pandora's box. From then on, many countries would equip themselves with cyber armies.
Since then, everybody has really pursued this disruptive, destructive capability.
Robert Lee served for a long time in the US Air Force and briefly with the NSA. After Stuxnet, he warned that the US too was vulnerable to cyber attacks.
As I kind of raised that point up in the government, and at the time just in the Department of Defense and the Air Force, a lot of people were like, what are control systems? What do you mean? Like, all the stuff that we use. Like, well, no, but we don't use the same stuff they'd use in Iran. Yeah, of course we do, actually. It's ubiquitous. And you could tell there was this moment for a lot of them where it was just crazy to think about the blowback effect of creating a capability to do something that revealed vulnerabilities or issues in systems we depend on a daily basis.
Ukraine became a testing ground for cyber weaponry.
Polygon means training camp, where special military units are trained. We believe that in 2015 and 2016, the whole of Ukraine was a training ground for cyber attackers.
This attack was not developed specifically for that substation. It would work in any other country around the globe.
The Sandworm Group had long had access to US networks. As early as 2014, cyber expert John Hultquist had warned that US energy suppliers were being spied on.
I wrote a blog and I said, look, I don't think they're in these companies to figure out what the price of gas is going to be, right? They're there to prepare to destroy something.
Hultquist dubbed the group Sandworm, a reference to the classic science fiction series Dune. Sandworms live underground. When they surface, the consequences are devastating. In Ukraine, civilians were the targets of the attacks.
The whole point of this is to stay below the level of war, right? Because nobody died. It was reversible, right? And short term. You might make the argument that it was designed precisely not to be an act of war, to be an act that goes right up to the edge.
Cyber attacks still take place in a gray area between war and peace, but that could change.
It's an honor to be here, but I think it's more likely we're going to end up, if we end up in a war, a real shooting war with a major power, it's going to be as a consequence of a cyber breach of great consequence.
The question is, how can you fight an opponent that attacks out of nowhere? Ever since the Second World War, the mighty United States has been suffering painful defeats, despite its superior weaponry.
We have the best military in the world. We have the best troops, the best training, the best technology. The U.S. military has more money than the other top 10 biggest militaries in the world combined. So what's the problem?
Above all, conventional warfare is profitable for the arms industry. Companies like Lockheed Martin earn billions selling fighter planes like the F-35. It's a technical marvel that's invisible on radar and automatically scans the ground for targets. It's precise, lethal, fast, and intelligent, but above all, it's expensive.
The whole program costs U.S. taxpayers and allies $1.5 trillion. This weapon has no utility. It's already obsolete. It's not deterring Russia or China. It's not winning wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, yet we're buying more of these things. So the F-35 is like the Maginot Line in 1939. It's an obsolete weapon built to win the last war and not the future war.
For almost 20 years, the highly armed U.S. forces and their allies have been fighting in Afghanistan. But the best technology is useless without a clear strategy. U.S. troops have also been fighting in Iraq for years.
Ready? 1, 2, 3, up!
So they wanted to put on a big show of the American military driving tanks across the borders, going all the way to Baghdad and taking Saddam down, culminating with that totally PR fabricated Saddam statue falling down in Firdos Square, in Baghdad in April of 2003. So the conventional stuff at the beginning was all a very carefully, meticulously organized show.
The United States and our allies have prevailed.
When they discovered that it wouldn't be peace-loving unicorns, the political leadership had three awful choices. They could either leave Iraq and Afghanistan and cede the field to terrorists. They could have a national draft like Vietnam to create the army big enough that would be needed to occupy these places for years to come. The third option was using private military contractors and contractors in general to fill the gaps that the U.S. military could not fill.
And that became the new normal. U.S. troops supported by private contractors. By the end of 2020, a total of 4,800 contractors would be working for the U.S. Army in Syria and Iraq.
And so by 2009, half of the American force in Iraq was contracted. Now, of that, only about 15% were trigger pullers. Most of them were just making food and repairing vehicles. But the United States of America is relying strategically upon the private sector to sustain wars, which is dangerous.
Ex-Navy SEAL Eric Prince saw an opportunity. With his company, Blackwater, he received contracts for personal security in Iraq. But it didn't stop there.
Very quickly, Prince, who was close to Dick Cheney, comes up with this notion that they can create an off-the-books CIA-type squad that can do things that the United States needs done without its stamp on it, without knowing that it was the United States of America.
In the shadow of the media-staged wars, the U.S. sent special forces on secret missions, including hunting down terrorists, partly with the help of private mercenaries.
The Iraq War was really the moment when the most powerful nation in the world, the United States, put its stamp of legitimacy and approval on the notion that the nation state no longer has the sovereign control of organized use of force, that it is acceptable for even veterans of the United States military to sell their U.S. taxpayer-funded knowledge and experience to the highest bidder.
At the time, military veteran Sean McFate was studying at Harvard University.
I was running across campus late for a statistics and economics midterm study group, and I got a phone call, and it literally went like this. You don't know who we are, but we know who you are. we have a job in Africa that we think you can help us with. Would you consider dropping out of Harvard to do it? We'll pay a flight ticket down to Texas where we're headquartered and we'll talk about it.
In the 1990s, McFate was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army. He then studied political science at the renowned university.
And I was like, midterm exam here, going to Africa to do something really strange up here. So I left Harvard, and 3 years later, I spent in Africa, basically building small armies for U.S. interest for a private military company that did work that the CIA and that the Department of Defense didn't want to touch.
As part of its global war on terror, the U.S. entered into shifting alliances with other armed forces, like here in Burundi. Sean McFate was among those who carried out secret missions with the help of the local military. He was tasked with preventing an assassination attempt being planned on Burundi's president, according to CIA information.
Did it work?
It did work.
How?
I can't tell you.
He doesn't talk about his other missions. There are reasons for secrecy.
When U.S. soldiers get killed, their deaths have to be reported. They have military funerals. They come back in flag-draped coffins. When contractors die, nobody really cares. For years, I used to track the number of contractor deaths, and it was very, very difficult to do it.
I mean, in some ways, I also knew that I was being used for plausible deniability because I was doing very risky operations that if they went poorly, the U.S. could disavow me. They said they never would, but we all knew that's easy for them rather than rescue me. They're called kite operations, where you can cut away the kite and let it float away.
This plausible deniability is a central motivation for these sorts of shadow military operations. It's especially helpful when something goes wrong, as it did in Venezuela in May 2020.
Today we're presenting the confession of the second U.S. Special Forces terrorist.
What's your name?
My name is Aaron Seth Berry.
What was the goal of the mission?
To get Maduro.
His wife, Melanie Berry, saw the video online.
It's something you can't imagine. You're just shocked.
Aaron Berry came to Germany with the U.S. Army. He fought in Iraq and Afghanistan.
He joined the army right after high school. He always wanted to serve his country and to help other people that way.
In 2013, he retired and worked as a tradesman in Schweinfurt, Germany.
When you've been doing what he did for so many years, you miss it a little, including the camaraderie.
In late 2019, he signed up for a secret mission in Colombia. On the border with Venezuela, among drug traffickers, spies, and corrupt officials, Berry trained with Special Forces colleagues and deserted Venezuelan soldiers. The goal was to overthrow the government in Caracas and bring self-proclaimed interim President Juan Guaido to power.
He wasn't president, he was a guy running around saying, hey, I'm really the president. So they have all these meetings, they have shadow diplomacy going on, and then you have figures who had been involved with the intelligence apparatus and military apparatus in Venezuela for years that are now part of the opposition, who are sort of whispering in Guaido's ear, we can work with mercenaries, we could arrest Maduro.
But the Venezuelan government already knew about it. State television even broadcast the names of mercenaries Luke, Aaron, and Jordan. Jordan Goudreau was in the Special Forces with Berry. He now sent his old comrade on a hopeless mission. On May 3, 2020, he announced via Twitter,
At 1700 hours, a daring amphibious raid was launched from the border of Colombia deep into the heart of Caracas. Our men are continuing to fight right now.
But their attack was anticipated. Aaron Berry was arrested together with other mercenaries in the coastal village of Chuao.
Here's the issue with the mercenary world. A lot of mercenaries are former vets right? They go to Iraq or Afghanistan, they do multiple tours there. They come home and they can't adjust well to civilian life. They're warriors and they're looking for wars. And now that mercenaries are now back on the table, it gives them optionality to do so. The problem is they don't know what they're getting into.
Go ahead, please. I just got information. Nothing to do with our government, but I just got information on that. So we'll find out. We just heard about it. But whatever it is, we'll let you know.
It was clear the mercenaries were on their own.
He's been sentenced to 20 years. Is it going to be that long? I hope not.
Not all American mercenaries are deserted by their government like Aaron Berry was. In 2007, Blackwater boss Eric Prince had to answer to Congress after his mercenaries killed 17 Iraqis in a shooting spree in Baghdad. U.S. President Donald Trump later pardoned the shooters from the incident. After the scandal, the Blackwater brand was tarnished. Prince set up new companies under changing names. One of them is based in Hong Kong.
He runs a company called Frontier Services Group based out of Hong Kong. It's owned primarily by Beijing. They do Belt Road Initiative stuff in Africa to strengthen Beijing's national interests.
And so you have Eric Prince, Mr. Captain America, I'm ultra patriotic, going into business with powerful figures directly connected to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party.
Eric Prince is working to become the global player in the world of shadow conflicts. The mercenary business is global. Moscow, too, relies on highly trained military veterans.
Russia always has used mercenaries, always, and particularly under Vladimir Putin. Putin comes out of the KGB. The KGB was using unofficial assets left and right all over the world, as the CIA was. None of this is new. What is new is the technology. It used to be that the spies would have to go and find these unsavory characters that could do the hit for you. Now they have websites.
For example, Russia's Wagner Group. Founded in 2014, the mercenary company is active in many conflict regions, including Syria, where Russian and U.S. units sometimes come menacingly close. In 2018, U.S. troops and Kurdish allies were operating in the oil-rich region east of the Euphrates River. To the west was territory controlled by the Assad regime, supported by Russia and Iran. On the night of February 7th, more than 100 mercenaries reportedly crossed the river and came under U.S. fire.
There are multiple narratives of what happened in that particular battle, and the narrative that the United States wants to put forward, and did put forward in the form of the Pentagon going on the record about this, was that elite commandos from the United States had to take defensive action to preempt a threat that was being posed by Russian mercenaries who were embedding with Syrian irregulars.
And you have like a Delta Force, Marines, Green Berets, with their Kurdish allies in a defensive position around a gas facility. And they call in B-52s, F-15 Strike Eagles, AC-130 gunships, Apache helicopters, drones, missiles, you name it.
The U.S. Air Force informed Russia's military leaders about the impending airstrikes.
We were told there were no Russians. That was right off the deconfliction line. They said, not our people.
Some Wagner mercenaries were said to have been flown out following the battle.
From my studying of how mercenaries work, you very rarely see hordes of mercenaries in a conflict. A handful of them go, but really the people doing the fighting are the local people, or they're mercenaries hired from another country just to be hired guns.
Some of these shadow fighters were taken to local hospitals the next day. How many and what nationality they were was something neither side had any interest in clearing up.
The reason it didn't go to World War III is because both Moscow and Washington could disavow the entire thing, saying these Wagner Group mercenaries are just mercenaries, and we don't care that much about mercenaries. So the world is turning, as wars become more shadowy, they're turning to shadow forces like mercenaries to get the job done.
The war in Ukraine is no conventional conflict either. Ever since the unrest in Maidan Square beginning in the winter of 2013, fighting has often involved covert operations. The conflict began with intense protests against President Viktor Yanukovych. His forces responded with rubber bullets, police batons, and eventually with live ammunition. But the demonstrators fought back for an entire winter. In February 2014, Yanukovych was removed from office, and Moscow lost an ally. Shortly afterward, Russian units began annexing the Crimean Peninsula. While President Vladimir Putin denied intervening, Russian-speaking mercenaries appeared in the Donbas region. The war in Ukraine is also a war over truth. Pro-Russian protests provided the perfect story for Moscow's shadow warfare.
What they did is they created a ghost occupation with weapons that gave them good, plausible deniability. They erected the fog of war and exploited it for victory. Because when Western policymakers were still trying to figure out what was going on in eastern Ukraine, the Crimea was already a fait accompli.
It was an undeclared battle between East and West, waged by mercenaries, covert operations, and cyber attackers.
Today we announce criminal charges against the conspiracy of Russian military intelligence officers who stand accused of conducting the most disruptive and destructive series of computer attacks ever attributed to a single group.
The U.S. Justice Department accused 6 members of a Russian military intelligence agency unit of being behind the Sandworm hacker group. From its headquarters, known as the Aquarium, operatives developed digital weapons for use in the gray area between war and peace. Russia had become a shadow market for hackers and potential mercenaries.
Russia's in an amazing position. All the real good talent is there, and all the talent has been committing crimes. So guess what? You have absolute authority over them because they can either do what you tell them or they can go to jail, and Russian jail is not great.
What the hackers had tested in Ukraine, they later repeated in the U.S. Russian cyber attackers infiltrated a software company in Texas.
SolarWinds is a firm that most people wouldn't think about or hear, but it's actually just all over the world in terms of our firms. I mean, tens of thousands of companies around the world use it. And the thing to think about is anybody they wanted access to, they had access to. So the only limitation they had was in their intent.
A sign of how vulnerable the U.S.'s critical infrastructure is came in May 2021. Pipeline operator Colonial was attacked, with Russian ransomware freezing the company. Gas stations ran out of fuel. The company paid $4.4 million ransom to get their data back.
It was the hardest decision I've made in my 39 years in the energy industry.
But the United States isn't only a target. It has its own cyber army. The NSA intelligence agency tries to find exploits, vulnerabilities in the software that can be used to penetrate foreign networks. One of those back doors was called Eternal Blue, designed to attack the world's most common operating system, Microsoft Windows. But the NSA lost control of its own cyber weapon. Unknown hackers copied Eternal Blue and distributed it on the internet. A short time later, it reappeared as part of NotPetya, the devastating cyber attack in Ukraine.
So one of the things that made NotPetya more effective was its use of Eternal Blue, which was a series of weaponized vulnerabilities that the NSA had actually developed. Eternal Blue was a set of vulnerabilities that really shocked everybody at how effective they were.
Exploits can be used for any kind of attack: espionage, blackmail, or sabotage. There's a growing market for that kind of malware. Manuel Atuk is a member of the Chaos Computer Club in Germany and a specialist in the protection of critical infrastructure.
For example, this is a trader of different exploits. They buy up vulnerabilities and security holes, or executable files exploiting them, so the misuse of those vulnerabilities.
This trader offers up to $2.5 million for an Android smartphone exploit.
It's legal, but of course it borders on what's ethical and moral. For example, if it became known that an exploit you sold led to a dissident in some country being persecuted, that would put you in a bad light.
That was the case with Mexican lawyer Carla Michelle Salas in 2015.
We were on our way to a meeting. I got a message from an unknown number. It was very personal. It said, "Carla, my family is grieving. My father died. I'm sending you the address of the funeral." I clicked on the link, but nothing happened.
Or so it seemed, but with that one click, Pegasus software had infected the cell phone.
It completely bugs the phone. You can turn on the microphone, take photos, access all the data. It's completely under the control of the attacker.
The software was developed by the Israeli company NSO Group. Founded by former intelligence agents, it exports Pegasus to countries including Mexico, Hungary, and Saudi Arabia. Ostensibly, NSO Group develops its products to fight terrorism. But who is and isn't a terrorist is something determined by its customers. The most prominent case was that of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Before he was murdered in Istanbul's Saudi consulate in 2018, his contacts' phones were hacked with Pegasus software. Mexico is among the biggest customers in the spyware market, supposedly because the state aims to spy on drug cartels. Shootings, murders, and disappearances are part of life here, and most of these crimes go unsolved. When she was hacked, lawyer Carla Michelle Salas was working on a case of multiple murders. Among the victims were photojournalist Ruben Espinosa and human rights activist Nadia Vera from the city of Veracruz.
They had left Veracruz after a series of threats and intimidation. Those threats came directly from the state government.
In 2018, State Governor Javier Duarte was sentenced to 9 years in prison for collaborating with drug cartels.
The organized crime is within the institutions of state power, and the state basically focuses on spying on and persecuting people they don't like, such as journalists or human rights activists.
Those representing the victims, including Salas, became targets themselves. In Mexico and around the world, Pegasus is used to spy on journalists, opposition figures, and other politicians. These days, installation no longer requires the clicking of a link. It's practically unnoticeable. A missed call is enough to infect a smartphone. And even phones that are not hacked can be dangerous. Modern military reconnaissance can easily find out where the owner of a cell phone is. Thanks to drone warfare, attacks can be carried out anywhere. This is the village of Khashamir in Hadramaut province in eastern Yemen. On August 29, 2012, 3 Hellfire missiles struck, killing 5 men. One of the first witnesses on the scene was Khaled bin Ali Jabr.
There were explosions like we'd never heard before. We saw dead bodies and blood everywhere.
Lawyers for the victims' families tried to find out why the U.S. drone strike happened at that particular time and place. The assumption is that it was a so-called signature strike, triggered through metadata of phone calls and the GPS positions of cell phones. The bin Ali Jabr family suffered 2 deaths. To this day, they don't know why. Attorney Jennifer Gibson represents them.
These are strikes that are taken not based on someone's known identity or any known fact about some crime they might have committed, but rather based on a pattern of behavior. Frequently, with signature strikes, they don't know who they're hitting.
Who the enemy is determined by surveillance data, and there's plenty of that. It's evaluated by computers, which look for suspicious patterns. The most important data source is cell phones and the SIM cards inside them.
So in many cases, they're giving designations to SIM cards or other identifiers without knowing who the people are, but they're essentially engaged in a kind of creative, extrajudicial legal process that could end in the death penalty.
Often innocent people are caught up in the fighting. One of them was Imam Salim bin Ali Jabr, who had preached at the local mosque that day. A few hours earlier, he and his son-in-law Ahmed were sitting in front of the mosque.
Salim's opinion about Al-Qaeda was clear. In this mosque, he criticized the murders committed by the group.
On that day, 3 strangers were looking for the imam, who had publicly denounced Al-Qaeda. A young policeman, Walid bin Ali Jabr, learned of this.
With the enthusiasm of a young policeman, Walid said, "I'll protect you." So they went down this street together.
Neither the imam nor the policeman suspected that the strangers were being targeted by U.S. drones. They walked from the mosque to the place where the strangers were waiting for them. Then the missiles hit.
Now, it could be that you're killing a hardcore terrorist that was going to commit harm to people. But I haven't seen many cases where they've proven that that was the case. What we hear a lot of is 10 Al-Qaeda killed, AQAP members killed, Taliban killed. We don't often hear names. And so if you presume that it's one target, one operation, and they kill 10 people, you have to ask, who are those other 9 people?
Since 2002, more than 300 U.S. drone strikes have been carried out in Yemen, more than half of them under President Trump. In August 2021, a conventional war came abruptly to an end when the U.S. military hastily withdrew from Afghanistan. During the withdrawal, a suicide bomber entered the crowds waiting at Kabul's airport and blew himself up. More than 80 people were killed, mostly Afghans. "13 U.S. Marines were also among the dead. U.S. President Joe Biden immediately ordered a retaliatory strike. A drone fired on a target in the middle of Kabul, reportedly an explosive vehicle of the Islamic State. Later, the U.S. admitted its intelligence was bad. The attack killed 10 civilians, 7 of them children.
Everything is a video game now. And we have all the toys in the world to do it. But you know what? So does China. So does Russia. So does Israel. This is the world we've created.
At least 18 countries currently use weaponized drones. They are controlled remotely, without oversight from courts or declarations of war. and sometimes almost entirely without human decision-making. Autonomous drones search for targets automatically. Fire and forget. Drones from at least 4 nations circle over Libya, for example. Fighting on the ground below are mercenaries and militia groups, many of them recruited and paid from abroad. Conventional warfare is increasingly being replaced by shadow warfare. Nuclear power in North Korea flaunts its weapons, but secretly dictator Kim Jong-un also unleashes his own cyber armies on the West. Iran and Israel have been waging a shadow war for decades, involving raids, sabotage, missile attacks, and assassinations, with varying levels of deniability. Meanwhile, private mercenary companies are profiting from the trend.
Mercenaries loathe to work themselves out of a business. So because of profit motive, they either start wars or elongate wars for profit, and conflict is the one commodity that can create demand for its supply.
— 20 or 30 years ago, this cyber culture was a sort of punk culture. Today, it's fundamentally changed. These days, it's just a hardcore business.
War has changed. The weapons that matter most today are weapons that give you plausible deniability and not raw firepower.
These shadow wars are seemingly unstoppable. They're constantly expanding into new territory in both the physical and the virtual world.